Max Abrahms is a professor of political science at Northeastern University, specializing in conflict and terrorism. He's in Boston this morning. Professor, first of all, a lot of people are trying to figure out how is it that a group can try and achieve an end game, in this case, by kidnapping children and actually setting schools on fire with other children inside. How does that happen? How do you get people to follow you?
Well, that's a very good question. A lot of people want to know, what are the motives of this group? What's the sort of the strategic logic of Boko Haram, blowing up all of these innocent civilians? And basically, terrorist groups tend to have two kinds of aims, two kinds of motivations. They have strategic goals. In this case, Boko Haram wants to establish Sharia law throughout the country. But Boko Haram also has organizational aims because organizations, militant groups, they require manpower and they require funding. And so the point of these hostage takings isn't so much to achieve the group's strategic demands. It's not going to help to establish Sharia law, but it could, if the government is willing to trade, it could increase the manpower of Boko Haram as well as its financial position.
Now, tomorrow is going to be a month since those girls were abducted. How should the Nigerian government respond, and should they even negotiate or bargain with a group that has done what Boko Haram has done?
The official position of almost every target country in the world is that they will not negotiate with terrorists. And when it comes to strategic goals, like establishing Sharia law, this is true. But when it comes to smaller demands of militant groups, like the release of militants in government custody or some kind of financial compensation, the reality is that governments do sometimes negotiate. If I were the Nigerian government, I would be much more willing to trade money for these hostages than I would want to release militants in government custody, because then these militants could in turn kill more people. And I also think that it's important for the government to vet out which militants might be released, because some of them are presumably more dangerous than others.
And I wanted to hit on something that you told us, which is that other groups, other terrorist groups, believe that Boko Haram gives them a bad name and they want to steer clear of this particular group. Why?
Well, basically, when militant groups blow up civilian targets, it carries with it a high political cost, because people throughout the world recognize that, innocent life, should be sacrosanct, that they should be protected. And what we're seeing is that even many sort of Muslim terrorist groups want to distance themselves from Boko Haram. And we've seen this before, particularly with respect to Al-Qaeda Central, which was very, very critical of AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as well as with ISIS in Syria, precisely because these groups were just engaged in too much indiscriminate violence against the population. And it's for this reason that I think that Boko Haram is rather lonely. Boko Haram internationally has very few friends, even in the Muslim world.
Max Abrahms, professor of political science at Northeastern University, joining us from Boston this morning. Max, thank you very much.
Well, half of South